Today I want to talk about critical reading, which complements Chapter 4 of your textbook. So critical reading is more than just reading the literal word-for-word information in front of you. You also need to make sure you look through and look at the text. Doing this will help you strengthen your writing too. So how do you look through a text? Most of the time you're looking through a text, reading the words and images to figure out what the author is saying. You're primarily paying attention to the content of each text, not necessarily its organization, style, or medium. Your goal is to understand the text's main points while gathering the information it provides. When you look at a text, you are determining why the author made particular choices. This is referred to as bias. It's reading what is stated and unstated by the author to figure out what the author really means. This is interpreting facts along with the author's attitude, using implied meaning to make accurate assumptions, and drawing accurate conclusions. Critical reading involves a higher level of sophistication in reading. By analyzing facts, opinions, and biased statements, by synthesizing groups of supporting statements to summarize or paraphrase, bringing individual clarity to the piece being read, which is your reasoning, and by evaluating how the information fits into the reader's historical perspective and if it meets standards of critical reading. So this goes back to the genre discussion in your textbook. So first you need to start by previewing the text. First of all, are you the intended audience? Are you the person that the writer had in mind when he or she wrote the text? Also need to think about the author's purpose. We talked about this a little bit before. An author's main purposes in academic writing is either to inform or to persuade. So how can you tell the difference? What are the major features? What is your initial response to the argument? The book suggests that you play a game called the believing and doubting game. First, imagine what you believe what the author is saying and that how the author has expressed this is brilliant. So you immediately side on the side of the writer. And then pretend you're a harsh critic and search for flaws in the author's argument. So in a way, you're playing devil's advocate. Annotating the text. This is something students do not do enough of. They don't actually handle the books. They can highlight or take notes in it. Ebooks even have a highlighting and note-taking feature that allows you to make comments within your ebooks. Another tool in annotating and summarizing and paraphrasing. And this is where you summarize what you've just read, or sometimes where you reword what you just read, which is a paraphrase. You need to analyze the proofs in the text. Examine the author's use of logos, ethos, and pathos. Logos is logic, ethos is ethics, and pathos is emotion. And these are all tools that writers use when they are making an argument. So we'll get to more of that in just a minute. You need to also contextualize the text. Consider the tone, style, and level of information and assumptions the author makes about the reader. Does the writer assume that you understand complicated vocabulary or complicated industry terms? That'll help you decide if this is something written on your level or if something it should be written for a different audience. For example, a report by a NASA engineer is going to contain a lot of jargon that may not be for a person who does not work in that field and may not be very easily understood. I also need to think about the cultural, ethical, and political context in which the text was written. This part speaks to how old the information is. If this is an article that was written in the 1980s about latchkey children, it would be out of date because the context in which there were a lot of kids being left home alone has changed between the 1980s and 2015. You need to analyze your own assumptions and beliefs. How did your initial reaction influence your overall interpretation? This will happen quite often when you're reading a persuasive essay that is trying to convince you of something that you may not fully agree with. So how did your beliefs or values influence your reaction to the text? Why did certain parts please or irritate you? And once you've read the text, have your views changed? Can you see what the other side is saying? Do you see it as a more valid point than you did before? The next thing you've got to do is respond to the text. So, was your initial response accurate? How did this text meet your own purpose? How did this text meet your own purpose? Why did you read it? Did it follow the genre? So that's referring the genre to the whole textbook is written about. Should you reread the text? Do you think there's something in there you didn't quite get or that perhaps you may have misunderstood? And is the text appropriate for your needs? This is very important when you're writing an essay and using research, because you need to make sure whatever you use as support in your essay matters. How do you translate critical reading into strengthening your writing? Respond to a text by evaluating what others have written. Why should people care about what the author has written? Where and why do you find the author's views compelling or not? Respond with the text positions, terms, and ideas by using what others have written. Okay, so that's when you're borrowing ideas from outside sources to strengthen your own arguments or strengthen your own information. You illustrate, authorize, borrow, or extend an author's idea to advance your own arguments. And the book talks about that too. Aristotle created 3 appeals for argument. And the formula that we still use today for argumentation or persuasion was created by the ancient Greeks, and it is called rhetoric. Aristotle explained how speakers attempting to persuade others to their point of view could achieve their purpose by relying on one or more of these appeals: logos, ethos, and pathos. And this was originally designed for speakers, not writers, but we have borrowed it and made it into writing. Logos is an appeal to logic. Uses logic and evidence to support ideas, and it's most commonly used in academia. So any kind of academic writing, you have to show logic. There are 2 ways to employ logos, either deductive reasoning or inductive reasoning. So the art of deductive reasoning. The basic idea here is that the writer begins with a generalization, then cites a specific case related to that generalization, from which follows a conclusion. So here's an excerpt from one of JFK's speeches in June of 1963. We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and as a people. It cannot be met by repressive police action. It cannot be left to increased demonstrations in the street. It cannot be quieted by the token moves or talk. It is time to act in the Congress, in your state and local legislative body, and above all, in our daily lives. So Kennedy began with the idea of a moral crisis, which is a general term, and then he breaks it down into how we are in a moral crisis and then what we need to do about it. A writer who argues inductively begins not with a generalization, but with several pieces of specific evidence. So let's look at an excerpt from Senator Robert Byrd in his address to Congress prior to a debate on gun control. I read of young men being viciously murdered for a pair of sneakers, a leather jacket, or $20. In 1951, there were 3.2 policemen for every felony committed in the United States. This year, nearly 3.2 felonies will be committed per every police officer. Something has to change. We have to stop the crimes that are distorting and disrupting the way of life for so many innocent, law-respecting Americans. The bill that we are debating today attempts to do just that. So this actually works exactly opposite to Kennedy's speech, where you start with the details and then you end with the summarizing statement. So here comes the tough part. We've all been taught to use statistics to back up your information in a paper. However, you have to be fair in how you present the statistics, and you have to be very diligent if you include statistics. Statistics can be stacked one way or the other to make one side of an argument appear more credible. This is called card stacking, and it is a type of logical fallacy. But this does not negate the argument. Instead, it just puts more responsibility on the reader. So anytime you're reading an article where you find statistics, you need to go into a little bit more detail, figure out where those statistics came from and if they are valid. And this does take quite a bit of time. But it's part of critical reading, and it proves that you can't take anything at face value. Ethos is the ethical appeal. Now this is a little different because it is not related to the subject under debate. It is based on the ethical status of the person making the argument. The writer must have a certain degree of credibility. So the writer must have good character, have sound sense, and be qualified to argue based on either expert experience with the subject matter or on a carefully conducted research. So that is how you establish your credibility when you're writing. Is your research sound? Have you included everything? Do you have opposing views? Do you have a rebuttal? And this is in a persuasive essay. You demonstrate good character by use of grammar. Developing presentations that are well organized, carefully reasoned, and thoroughly referenced with source citations speaks to your ethos. And these are hallmarks of writers who care deeply about their work. So this is everything that you put out, that you write, becomes part of who you are and what you stand for. So this is how things like MLA formatting and the proper use of commas come into effect and how they are important and why. Pathos is an appeal to emotions. Academic writers rely heavily on logic and evidence, and they rarely employ pathos. There is nothing wrong with appealing to emotions, but it must be done very carefully, and pathos cannot be the only basis of the argument. So here's an example from Ronald Reagan's first inaugural address. He's referencing the view from the Capitol to Arlington National Cemetery. Under one such marker lies a young man, Martin Treptow, who left his job at a small-town barber shop in 1917 to go to France with the famed Rainbow Division. There, on the Western Front, he was killed trying to carry a message between battalions under heavy artillery fire. We're told that on his body was found a diary. On the flyleaf under the heading, My Pledge, he had written these words, America must win this war. Therefore I will work, I will save, I will sacrifice, I will endure. I will fight cheerfully and do my utmost of the issue of the whole struggle dependent on me alone. The crisis we are facing today does not require of us this kind of sacrifice that Martin Treptow and so many thousands of others were called upon to make. It does require, however, our best effort and our willingness to believe in ourselves and to believe in our capacity to perform great deeds, to believe that together with God's help, we can resolve the problems which now confront us. In this speech, Ronald Reagan is trying to get people to buy into his theories. And we've got the example of what happened to this soldier in 1917, and it makes us feel connected. It pulls at our heartstrings. So this is how descriptive writing kind of plays into this as well. All right, there are limits to all arguments. Arguments are not won on the basis of logic and evidence alone. In the real world, arguments are not scholarly debates. If the purpose of an argument is to change a person's feelings toward a subject, or to have the reader agree with the writer, then the writer must be aware that factors other than logic and evidence come into play. These factors involve cultural, religious, ethnic, racial, and gender identities, moral preferences, and the effects of personal experiences. You're not writing in a bubble. Your preferences and beliefs and the ones held by our culture come into play also.